Okay, are you ready? Maybe. Maybe ready. Well, the reason this is here, it's right in front of me, is I have a friend in the Netherlands that said she wanted to listen to this, but they're 8 hours ahead of us. So what is it, about 2 in the morning or something for them? I don't know anyway. So my hunch is it was bravado and nice, but I doubt if she's going to see it. So, but hi, Yvonne, anyway. Well, welcome. I'm glad you're here. Honored that you're here. Hope that this is both fruitful and productive and disturbing and stretching, because it's a topic that most people don't want or think about very much, and that's internal development, interior development, what goes on inside of us. Usually the only time adults have to deal with this is when they're in trouble. So there's some kind of crisis precipitates asking questions about what goes on inside. So I want to give you a little background for why I'm interested in this. And then one of the things that helps me is if you ask questions, which means you have to be willing to interrupt. Otherwise, I'm kind of like a train. Sometimes I get going and it just lots of stuff, which may be interesting, and that may be what we're supposed to do. But if you can stop me and say, clarify this brings up that question, it would direct where we can go. I was thinking about this the other day. I've been a counselor of some sort for about 50 years. And that's, from my point of view, that's been a privilege. I've been given a ton of information coming at me. So if you know anybody in the helping professions, most of them will say they walk away receiving more than they give. It's part of the business in a sense. It's just you get more, you receive more than you can possibly give back. So I've been honored to do that, and I've had lots of experience listening to people's stories. And one of the things that has marked 50 years of thinking about that is that very few people grow up unless they have to. And by most standards, most people aren't forced to. So we grow up in one dimension, usually vocationally, or sometimes we'll grow up and have to work on something out of our past because of trauma or some other kind of thing. All things I want to talk about. But it's interesting to me how many people stop their development for a myriad of reasons. And some are really harsh reasons and obvious, and some are subtle and obscure. But there's still issues. So what I propose we talk about is what does maturity really look like, and why is it important for adults to address this topic? In education, I got to teach in developmental psych for a while. In education, one of the things that you find is that almost all of our research stops at the end of adolescence. Hardly any adult-driven research occurs, unless Harvard did a longitudinal study for 70 years. But the results of it were thin because they didn't set it up at the beginning to learn what you needed to learn 50, 60 years later. So it's just fascinating to me that this part of life is left out. I would argue that being an adult is probably the most demanding, strenuous, arduous, tumult-filled period of life. It's the longest by far, and most people are just thrown into it without being equipped. I had fun for about 15 years, I guess, assessing church planters in Europe. So this was people that wanted to go to Europe to plant a church. And in Europe, if you ask to plant a church, they say, what? They know how to plant a tree, but not a church. It doesn't make sense to them. So then you have to clarify it. You have to clarify that we want to start a church, and then they say, why? Because they left the church alone, 50 years ago or something. But my job was to assess whether people were prepared, set, in shape, strong enough to do that job. And I found myself quite often saying, you're not ready. It's not that you couldn't do this. It's just that you're not prepared to do this. You're not in shape to do it. Nobody's said these are the things that you need to do. And what I knew was going to happen was if you go cross-culturally, get dumped into another culture, which probably some people in here have experienced, and you have to learn a language, and then you've got to adapt to that culture, plus do a job. And if it's ministry, it adds dimensions to it that are even more difficult, because what do you tell somebody in a country that doesn't care? For instance, they don't care whether the church exists or not. They don't care. They don't talk traffic in that metaphysical dimension very much, or spiritual dimension very much. So I had these people, and sometimes I would say, no, I don't think you should go. And they thought I was saying they shouldn't ever do that. And that's not what I was saying. I was just simply saying, you're not ready. And if I put you there, I'll put you in harm's way. If I check off and say, yeah, you're okay, you maybe got the right desire and the right heart and maybe even some gifts to do ministry, but you're not prepared for what's coming that's going to stress you. So the things that grow us are stressors. And most of us in our culture have learned that we shouldn't have any stress. That's why we go to the doctor a lot of times. Get rid of my anxiety, my uncomfortableness, my whatever makes me uncomfortable, right? So I'm going to argue with you tonight that if you're going to be an adult, what we now know about adults' development is pretty profound. And there's a reason why, because in the last almost 27 years, we have had access to the human brain in a way we never had before. 1990 was a pivotal year, basically, for brain research. So I want to talk about that in terms of how it affects us developmentally in some ways. But maybe it'll be easier to start just talking about what our culture looks for now as success in living for adults. And does anybody want to guess at what the number one word would be that people are going after, that they use as a value to evaluate whether they're functioning as an adult well or not? Money. Happiness. Happiness is probably the cover, okay? So I'm going to stick it up here, but I can spell it. Maturity. Now, in the last about 40 years, this has been studied. And people keep writing books. I probably have read 10 books on happiness, studies of what makes people happy. So this last week, I've talked to two couples that are not interested in staying married because they're not happy. That's the way they describe it. And when you ask them, what are they going to tell you? Why aren't you happy? Take some shots at it. I'm not in love anymore, okay? Fell out of love. Well, it's too hard. I did a wedding here 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I just read a little blurb by Scarlett, and I couldn't remember her last name. I called her O'Hara, but that's my generation. That's from Gone with the Wind, you know. So Scarlett Johansson. Scarlett Johansson's out of her second marriage, and she's talking about marriage, and she says she doesn't know anybody for whom marriage is easy. It's really, really hard for everybody. And she said it can't be natural or normal if it's that hard for everybody, can it? So apparently, monogamy is not going to lead to happiness. So why would you do it? It's way too difficult to do. And so I actually quoted her in this wedding. I don't think I gave credit to her for it, actually, but I would if somebody had asked. It just is too hard, right? This isn't natural. It's not natural to be monogamous for a lifetime. And part of what's driving that is this underlying piece of the puzzle called happiness. What other reasons would people say they're not happy? Fallen out of love.
Unmet expectations.
Yeah, there you go. Expectations are killers, aren't they? We come into a relationship expecting, well, maybe hoping, probably expecting that the other person will somehow meet all my unfulfilled needs. Read my mind. Or vice versa, I'm supposed to read her mind. It doesn't, however that works, we wind up going, oh my goodness, this is too much, and you don't want to do it, and you can't, and you stop, or some other kind of thing happens. So, yeah, expectations are deadly, absolutely deadly in a relationship. You'll see why here later, but anyway. What else keeps us from staying in a relationship? What are some of the other things you hear? Oh yeah, there we go. We're growing apart. Too different. They've changed. That's not the person I actually married.
Unspoken rules.
Yeah, unspoken rules. Like you were supposed to take the trash out and didn't. Got it. Irreconcilable differences. Here. Both, yeah. We're different, so if we could just pick somebody that was more like me. Isn't that a song in My Fair Lady? Why can't a woman be more like a man? Men are so blah, 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 You don't hear that song sung very much, but anyway. What else? What else keeps us from being happy?
Financial trouble.
Financial problems, sure. Finances are tangible. You can hang more weight on them than they deserve. They're actually, as one sociologist said, he said all money stuff is secondary. We use it for secondary use. We don't use it as primary. So it doesn't really it keeps us from having to deal with the up close stuff. It keeps it out here somewhere. It keeps it at a distance from us. Primary money would be like using a dime to tighten a screw. That's primary use. Or using a dollar bill to start a fire. That's primary. Secondary use is that it uses, instead of a bartering system, I get a chicken for giving you a haircut. Then that's primary. So we've twisted money, actually, until now it's virtual pretty much in our world, and so but it causes problems because it's so tangible. So yeah, it's a big fermenter. No, yeah, no.
Or like even like movies, or it just seems like everybody encourages you. It's all about you. If you're not happy, then leave. It's like outside worldly influences, or even like movies. Romantic movies. Oh, it should be like that. Yeah. So I was thinking about that.
It's almost like the phrase "and they lived happily where." Ever after? It's a big lie, isn't it? What's that? That's entitlement. Expectations again. Okay. My point is, happiness is not sustainable as a relational foundation. It's not sustainable in terms of the way we're made. But one of the arguments that I want to make tonight in particular is, and I want to make it in two dimensions. One is what I believe spiritually. I think the world is primarily created relationally. And that That's our relationship to things and plants and animals and that, and the creation in that sense, but also with each other. We are designed to be in relationship. And if the biblical story is correct, it says that there were 4 relationships that broke down at the beginning. One with God, one with creation, one with each other. What's the last one? One with ourselves, right? And it's the breakdown with ourselves that I want to talk about tonight and tomorrow. How do we relate to ourselves in a healthier way, in an increasingly healthier way, so that we're more resilient, more robust, more hardy, more whole, more healthy, more mature? My thesaurus just ran out. Yeah. How do we do that? How do we foster that kind of development in an adult when there's not a crisis? I get to work with pastors that are mostly come to this place that I work because of crisis. And I've concluded that crisis will help you change, but it won't transform you. Because you can't sustain crisis as a motivator. Crisis won't motivate you, okay, and it's unsustainable. So you can change behavior as a result of a crisis, but it won't transform you. Now, it's not a simple example, but an example might help. I had a couple come to me. She had gone to seminary to find a godly man. That was her purpose. She wanted to find somebody she could trust that would be upright, that would be godly, right? Good guy. That's what she wanted. So she married this guy. They're like 5 kids into their relationship. And she drug him into my office because she caught him watching pornography. And she was on his case, and he was getting smaller. He's a big guy, but he was getting smaller as he sat there. And the longer she talked to him, about him, at him, judging him, shaming him as much as she possibly could, she was furious. She said, I don't know what I'm going to do. How can I stay in this with this debauched, distorted, perverted thing? She couldn't even call him a person. And I remember saying to her, if I could guarantee you that he would never look at pornography again, would you be satisfied? And she scrunched up her eyes and she said, you ask trick questions. She said, I want to say yes, I'd be satisfied, but I'm pretty sure the answer is no. I said, you're right, it is no. Why? Why is the answer no? Why wouldn't she be satisfied? Well, yep, the trust is broken. But if he wouldn't ever look at pornography again, why wouldn't that be enough?
Because it's probably going to do something else wrong.
And he can never meet all her needs.
Yeah. Over expectations.
He can never meet all her needs.
Well, he couldn't meet all her needs. That's true. Stay with this one little tight illustration. Yep.
Still judgmental, then she has something else to judge.
Yep. He'll do something else wrong. Okay. Keep going. Come on. You can do it.
Well, the looking at pornography is an external move based on something
Internal.
going on internally, and that's what needs to change.
That's right. I wanted to move her from thinking out here, if he changes his behavior, I'll be satisfied. Which, by the way, we're forever satisfied with changed behavior, thinking that that's enough. And I said, until you have some confident understanding of transformation on the inside, that he understands where this comes from, how it's fed, where it gets its energy, what stimulates it, where's the trigger, triggers. What? And I said, you've taken yourself out of the game by judging him. He's not going to come to you. Then I turned to him and I said, don't stop looking at pornography, which meant that I lost my Christian Counselor of the Year award at that moment. Because you don't say that to a client, right? He looked at me kind of funny, and she looked at me angry. And I said, why am I saying that to him? Why am I saying it to him?
Because you're not getting to the root of the problem.
That's right. So if he stops looking, what happens?
He just does something else.
He'll go someplace else. That's right. And he hasn't had to attend to what's going on inside of him. Now, some people do that more naturally. Some people are more introspective naturally. It's kind of a personality thing. You know, I was working with a guy just a couple weeks ago, and he's built, shaped like, and personality-wise, an engineer. So he doesn't go to his emotional world very easily. In fact, we had to work at convincing him he did have an emotional world. He did, but he wanted the data. He wanted everything to be a problem to solve. He wasn't understanding about how tough relationships are. And we don't train people in relationships unless they're in trouble. So I would argue, if I could get into a high school program and make as a primary training piece of the curriculum, it would be emotional and relational development. Because we know a ton about it, but it only gets fed to us outside of that. When you need it as an adult, it simply isn't there because we simply haven't had a place to train. And we think we all have it naturally. I had a girl years ago, she told me a story. She said, you're the first person I've ever told this story to. The story was horrific. I still remember. I mean, it was just, I'm glad I was sitting, and I tried to be cool. That's why I wear a beard, so nobody can tell, you know. So I'm sitting there trying to be cool, and all I could think of was, oh my gosh, what kind of a story is that? That's the first part. The second part was, what should I say back to her that would be helpful? So, being really cool, right? I said something like, how normal do you think that story is? What do you think she said? She said, this is probably what everybody has gone through. And I said, guess what? You're less than 0.5% of the world's population has experienced something as crazy as that. Normal for her, right? You've all been in relationships. You've all been raised somehow. You've all been in some family. You all have experience. But experience will not give you the basis, the data you need to do interior work. Because experience actually acts as a limiter in your training. Did you know that? Experience is so strong. I'm going to try to show this to you brain-wise here in a little bit. But experience is so strong in us that we weight it. It gets way too much weight in the equation. And experience is not the best teacher. Actually, revelation is somebody else's experience. Learn from somebody else. I trust. This is an old illustration, but I trust. I don't want HIV. And you know why I don't want it? Because I know people who have had it. And their experience, I trust them. I don't want that. Does that make sense? So that's learning by revelation. And what allowed me to trust the information I got? Well, it was the strength of the relational bridge I had built with that person, or that study, or that resource, or whatever it was. It's a relational piece that allows you then to do that kind of interior work, if you will. Okay, so back to happiness. If happiness is not good enough to grow us up, in fact, I would argue that it's probably doing just the opposite. Happiness is dumbing us down, or retarding us, or regressing us in some way. What other things relate to happiness that might be helpful? An idea called pleasure. Pleasure is related to how you feel and to your senses. I'm not sitting in those chairs, so I don't know if they're pleasant or not, you know. After an hour or two, you might say, not so much, you know, or not for my anatomy, or whatever the case may be. That's not a pleasant experience. But pleasure is limited to sensation, to your senses. If something's too loud, it's not pleasurable. If it's too quiet, you have to strain to hear it, you know. So what's pleasant to you is tied to sensation. What makes happiness go is pretty much tied to happenings or circumstances. There's a term in Greek used in the New Testament called contentment. And the word actually means independent of circumstance. If you're content, you are independent of whatever circumstance you're in. So if the stressors are high in your life, whether they be physical or emotional or relational or vocational or familial, it doesn't matter. If those stressors are high, your contentment is going to be based on the strength of your internal development to not be at the mercy of the circumstance. Did I say that right? I think I did. Did I make it too complicated? Do I need to do it again? Okay, good. Yeah, so happenings are what we work for. We think that if we get this, a good house, an operating car, enough money in the bank, health, you know, whatever, that we'll be happy. When people die, what's the thing that most people talk about valuing at the very end of life? Family, which is relationship. Isn't that interesting? It's not achievement, and it's not legacy. It's relationship. How are we doing?
Why are we so driven the other way? Like, you know, I was just listening to that song recently that it's an old song, but like, it's a country song. The guy asked the guy, like, when he found out he only had a few days to live or whatever, would you do? And he climbed the mountain, and, you know, but he wished he would have loved more kindly and stuff. Like, why? We all know that. Like, when we're on our dying bed, we really want to be known for. We don't really want to be known for all those other things. We just want to have relationships with our loved ones. So why are we so driven the other way?
Did you hear a question? Why are we so driven in the opposite direction of the things that we claim to really value, at least philosophically, theoretically, maybe heart-wise? We even value being close to somebody, but it's like we don't know how to get there. We don't have a bridge to that stuff. Here's what brain science will teach you. Within 18 months of birth, in the brain, you have essentially formulated the key elements for the rest of your life, unless you go back and disturb that stuff. And the reason is your memories are emotionally stuck. The way your brain develops is from the bottom up, okay? It starts with the oldest part of your brain, the most primitive part, and that's what a kid's getting. And I'm going to go through that here in just a few minutes. But if you think about it, within 18 months, you're almost shaped, unless there's some strategic, significant intervention that says, no, there's an alternative to the way that you emotionally remember. Some very fascinating stuff. Your brain functions so quick that in 140 milliseconds, which is like 0.4 of a second. Yeah. Have you ever been in an accident and you saw it coming and your brain just seemed to accelerate? You remember thinking 500 things just within this milliseconds. Well, that's your brain functions that way, and so you got a part of your brain that functions really fast. And that's this emotional side. It's the right side of your brain. It's supposed to be the leading side of your brain. It's the relational side. It's the artistic side. It's the connection side. It's the piece of the brain that should be the master. But in the Western world, and since the Enlightenment, we've emphasized the left side. The linear thinking, rational thinking, slow thinking processes that don't counter what's going on inside. So I'll draw this up here in just a few minutes. But what you're asking is, you're saying, why don't we do this earlier? And a lot of times it's because we have this kind of automatic response that we learned from 0 to 18 months. Now, when I was trained in psychology, that wasn't on the table. I told you just a minute ago, we didn't have access to the inside of the brain without the person being dead until 1990 about, to study this. I mean, we had access to the inside of the brain, but a lot of people didn't survive that. You know, hey, I see the inside. Oh, gosh, you're not talking to me anymore. You know what happened? Sorry, but now we have ways to measure that, and we found that the brain is plastic enough, or can learn well enough, that we don't have to stay caught in that history. So I'm going to give you an assessment tonight before you leave. So the last 30 minutes, I'm going to do a kind of a maturational, emotional assessment that you have to take by yourself. You don't share it. This is just yours. To try to get you at some of the questions that maybe you can ask about, how about my development? Where did it go off the rails, if it did, or what makes it hardy and healthy, if it is? And just having a better understanding of it really does matter. Okay, do you know what the third word up here should be? Comfort. Comfort? No, that's a great word, though. Comfort would be under pleasure. What'd you say?
Power.
Power? No. Power would probably be related to this one, because that's circumstances. I need the power over circumstances, so if I can control the circumstances enough, then I'll be okay. Make sense? It's a biblical term. It doesn't belong just in the Bible, but joy. Here's an interesting thing. There's a guy named C.S. Lewis who wrote about joy probably more than any other single author that I know of. And here's what he says about joy. He says, joy has an unmistakable mark or ingredient of grief and sadness in it. So in order to have joy, accurate joy, joy is not a feeling. That would be pleasure. Happiness is more of a feeling state. Joy is a perspective. Joy is a way to look at something. That's what I'm going to argue with you tonight. How do you look at these things in your life? Nancy and I started out, we just liked each other. But we were naive, and we were functioning out of our own histories. So most of our memories were emotional memories. They were young brain memories. They were what I would call the emotional brain instead of the thinking brain. And so the emotional brain always wins. Thinking brain will never win. Do you understand that? So that's part of what we have trouble with. I think we don't realize that what has to be changed is this fast, just screaming fast function of your brain to protect you. That's what it's designed to do. It's designed to keep you protected in some way. And it goes so fast you can't think about it. You're not aware of it. And by the way, it repeats this process more than 6 times a second. So that's how you're constantly your brain constantly is processing that kind of data all the time about, am I okay? Is this an okay environment? Am I going to be liked here? Do people care about me? It's that kind of piece of the puzzle. So we'll go through that here in just a second. But I think the challenge for us is to realize that if joy is a perspective, what joy does biblically is it teaches you how to manage stressful situations. They're not the determiner of whether you feel okay inside or not. They're not the determiner of whether you're going to respond, and I think I like the word you use, in a kind way. By the way, there's words like kindness and gentleness are very concrete words for us as assessment tools. You know if you're being kind to somebody or if you're not. You know, I mean, I busted something glass on the floor the other day, and I was picking it up, and I was thinking, number one, I just marveled that you could adjust your fingers to pick up something that sharp, not get cut by it, because you're being what? Careful and gentle, right? You know that. So that's not so far out there or really wildly abstract, that you could be gentle with one another, which, by the way, was the description of Jesus when he describes himself. There's only one place in the New Testament where Jesus talked about his own personality. It's in Matthew 11. And he describes himself in two ways. He didn't describe himself as king or master or Lord or God. He used these two descriptors, gentle and humble. It's in Matthew 11:28. He says, "Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, I'll give you rest." And if you read deep enough, you'll find out in Jeremiah 6 that the people didn't really want the rest he offered them, because the rest he offered them was that they were to walk in these ancient paths and good ways that he'd already told them, and they didn't want to do the work. So and I think that's what happens to a lot of us. We don't want to do the work. So he gets these two words, gentle and humble, as descriptors. Isn't that fascinating? God describes himself a lot in the Old Testament, but Jesus only once. And he uses two really interesting words, gentle and humble. That response should change things, because it's later, it's in Peter, I think, where Jesus says, I am the, no, it's in Hebrews, I am the exact representation of God. So you look at Jesus, you're going to see God. And that's the place you have to start. Number one, that's the place that it begins to make some sense. And he was what? Gentle and humble. And then there's this passage of Scripture in Hebrews 12, which I want to kind of start with tonight. I'm going to read all three verses. Chapter 12, verses 1, 2, and 3. This is after this long litany of all these guys in the Old Testament, most of the guys in the Old Testament, that had walked by faith. And they'd walked by faith, and they'd been successful. And then there's a group of guys that had walked by faith, and they weren't successful on the outside. They were sawn in two and boiled in oil, and other happy things happened to them, right? And then it starts in chapter 12, it says this, since we have such a great cloud of witnesses, or such a great community around us. Now, by the way, one of the things that will make and is necessary ingredient for maturity to occur is to have relational community. It can be a family, it can be bigger than that, church, etc., but you need others in your life. You can't do this alone. Since we have so great a cloud of witnesses, he says, let us lay aside every encumbrance. I just want to stop there for a second. In the text, when it talks about encumbrance, it's telling us that what we have is we have things in us that get in our way, things in us that slow us down, things in us that we're carrying along from our histories, things in us, memories that are not accurate, that aren't telling us the truth, that are making us afraid, things that drive us if you've got a kind of a driven personality, or you know, I was talking to this guy this last week that was an engineer, and he'd never been in this world of emotion. He didn't know what to do with it, and his marriage was about to crumble as a result. And so he had this long talk about it, and I told him, I said, oh, I've got another couple clients through the years that I've given the same prescription to. He said, what's this? I said, it's actually cheaper than paying me my full fee. So he looked excited. Of course. And I said, you need to go to a junior college and take a drama course. Now, what do you have to do in a drama course? You have to work out somebody else's thoughts, feelings, emotions, right? And experience. You have to communicate that to somebody else. And so This one guy in Texas, he did. He wanted to save money, and so he did. He went off and did this class, and his wife called me. I don't know, about a year later, she said, "What did you do to him?" And I hadn't seen him. I mean, we stopped. He went and took the course. I didn't know what happened to him. But as a result of taking that course, what did it do for him?
Time to verbalize feelings.
He could verbalize feelings. He could make them more accurate, right? He had more, yeah. He had more than the male emotions, which are irritability and anger, I think. Aren't those the two? Sorry, guys. Huh? Yeah. And he was getting feedback, but it wasn't his. He was reading a script, but he had to communicate the whole thing, and they'd say, "You just look frustrated, not really hurt, or that's not hurt. That's just irritability. So come on, do better, And then he'd say, "Well, what's irritability look like?" And so off they'd go. Well, so this stuff is not magic at that point. You can learn it. Anybody can, regardless of personality, it seems like, and regardless of history. So like I like to say to people, if you run up against people that are really problematic in your life, maybe they're in your family, you've got to look at them as wounded, not bad. And wounded is when something is withheld from you growing up, or something is imposed on you growing up, either of which are distorters. I'll give you a list of those if you stick around long enough. Both what's withheld from you, things you didn't get, which, by the way, are trickier to deal with. If you've been directly abused, or if your father died when you were 3, or if there's some tangible thing, then that's easier to deal with than something that's intangible, like nobody ever drew a boundary for you, or you weren't hugged, or those pieces of the puzzle are wildly devastating to early development, but we don't know it quite often. Okay? So in this passage, he says, lay aside every encumbrance. And I think it's important to understand we have lots of stuff that encumber us, and most of it is history that we're dragging along, that we've not disarmed in some way, that we've not rendered impotent or detoxified it in some way. We have a history. And if you're going to be free, then you don't want a backpack, an encumbrance. You don't want to be dragging something along. So, but it ties it. It makes it it's fascinating. He says every encumbrance and sin. So encumbrances aren't necessarily sin. I worked with a pastor just a couple weeks ago, and he's an over-functioning guy. You can over-function or under-function. Most missionary couples over-function or under-function. I sent some home from the missionary field because there was a lot of money being poured into their lives, and they were just barely surviving as a family in that culture. They weren't doing anything else. They just had themselves on their hands. Well, it's nice to live in Italy if you want, but you got to work if you're going to be there. And so they couldn't do it. And then I have others that's all they can do is work. They don't know anything else. They don't know how to play. They don't know how to relax. They can't let go. So you have over-functioners and under-functioners. And ministry draws them, both extremes usually. Hardly any get into this kind of integrated middle where there's tension, yeah, but you can both play and work in appropriate ways. Not as easy as it sounds. So he goes on, he says this. He says, which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that's set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy, here's the word, who for this joy set before him, endured the cross, despised the shame, sat down at the right hand of God. And he said, the whole purpose is in verse 3. He says, consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself. He gets killed, obviously, so that you may not grow weary and not lose heart. In other words, you're not going to give up. and you're not going to lose. You're not going to be hopeless. Lose heart, right? No matter what the circumstance, and the circumstance that the writer of Hebrews is talking about is Jesus hooked joy and the cross together. This horrific death and joy put together. It was because of joy that he could endure the cross. Isn't that fascinating? So when C.S. Lewis says joy has an unmistakable mark of grief and sadness in it, that's what he's talking about. And for most of us, the grief part means that we have to be able to let go of, open our hands to, the things that we've identified ourselves with for most of our lives, which happens to be our memories, our habits, the things that were given to us before we were even verbal in those first 18 months. And the brain learns this. And it won't give it up unless you can target it in some way and then train yourself to push back against it, because it's not telling you the whole story. It's telling you part of the story, but you know, it's like a client of mine had been abused for a long time, and she was sitting in my office and she was beginning to dissociate, kind of break down, and I remember saying to her, "What's happening to you right now?" And she finally stopped. I said, "What's happening right now in this minute? You know, not what happened to you 15 years ago or 20 years ago. What's happening right now?" She said, "Well, it feels like that." I said, "But what's happening right now?" So what was I doing? Trying to pull her into this moment to do a little reality check. Because what her brain was telling her was, well, I feel the same, so therefore it must be the same. But she was getting the messages backwards, but that was her way to protect. And she needed to protect to survive what she had to survive to get there. But by the time I'm talking to her, that's worthless to her now. It's actually counterproductive for her own soul. You guys aren't interrupting me very much. Did you know that? Have you noticed that? I have. Okay.
I'll interrupt you.
Good.
When you were
Thanks.
talking, I was thinking about my son when he was 2. He wore these Thomas the Tank Engine little slippers, and he would not take them off. Days and days and days. He would leave these on until they gave him athlete's foot. And we just tried to coax him off, but they were comfortable, and until it was not good for him anymore. And I just think about that in my own lives, that those things that hinder us, they're comfortable. They've been on us. They keep us warm and toasty, whether they're helpful or healthy for us.
And that's a great word. Somebody else mentioned it over here. The word comfort.
Yeah.
It's amazing how we create our own comfort zones so that we could survive, but you don't thrive. You don't develop that way. So comfort becomes kind of a tricky piece of the puzzle. We think if we're at ease, comfortable, that's really a wonderful thing, and it's not a bad thing, except the limit of it is we're not designed that way. We're designed to produce. We're designed to be stretched. We're designed to grow. We're designed to be challenged. We're designed to be disturbed. We're designed to learn. We're designed to be in relationship. We're designed to be challenged. We're designed that way. That's what a relationship is for. A relationship exposes you. In fact, I think that's the fundamental purpose of a relationship biblically, is to expose you so that you can grow. And if you grow, what happens? Relationally. The more you grow, the more you have to give. And the most single satisfying thing in your life, I guarantee it, will be your ability to give to somebody else. But the problem is, as an infant, you need to learn how to receive first. And what an infant needs is they need somebody to delight in them. Not be proud of them. Delight in them. I asked an NFL player, he was a linebacker for the Cowboys. It's in my office. And I don't know where we were in the conversation. not at all. I just know what this precipitated. And I said, when have you felt precious? And he looked at me, and he started crying, and then he couldn't stop. It was one of those snotty cries. And when you get a linebacker snotty crying, it's not pretty. And you don't know what to do. You can't hug them. I mean, they're too big to hug, you know. So, and you give him paper towels or something. I don't know. It was just, but it was endearing, and it was painful, and it was wildly sad. He'd been the biggest kid always. Never, ever felt any kind of preciousness. He was admired for his ability, but not for who he was. Does that make sense? So it's that little piece of the puzzle that's so important starting off. And a child has to learn how to receive that. A lot of times it's not in his world to be received. It's a two-way street, so it's problematic. It's not just direct. If we could just do it perfectly, it would be wonderful. It doesn't happen that way. But what we've learned is that sets up the brain for this relational dynamic that is what we're made for. We're made to be in relationship. And it starts there. Yeah.
What was the word you used, infants would need to be
Delighted in.
delighted?
Yeah.
It's really interesting to think about comfort and pleasure and stuff, because if we think about the stuff that we know is good for us, it's often uncomfortable. And I was just thinking about our daughter, she hates getting a toothbrush, absolutely hates it, but it's good for her, you know, and so if we just love the things that we're comfortable with and just like, not being healthy, it seems like. It's just about that.
Well, for a child, and the first, I don't know, 3 so months, birth through age 3, he or she needs to gain this sense of receiving somebody's delight in them. Does that mean there can't be any limits? No, there has to be limits. If you withhold all limits from a child, you're actually abusing them. There, but there can be too many limits, over-functioning, under-functioning. Here we go again, right? It's this middle area that fouls people up. And so, before we go too much further, I'm going to draw you a diagram that I'll come back to again and again and again, because I think it's so important to realize that's what we're dealing with as humans. I'll put it over here. I call this holy space. And on one side I'll put a male and a female, and tell you that the way we're designed is to move toward one another, so we should move into this space. When you move into that space, what's there is more exposure, more uncomfortableness, more challenge, more disturbance, more being stretched. This is where intimacy occurs, and it's why so few people experience intimacy in a lifetime. If you have one intimate friend, hopefully it's your mate, but if you have one intimate friend in a lifetime, you're pretty rich. That's how unusual it is. And we've had the leisure to study intimacy in the last 75, 80 years of Earth's history. Up until then, we didn't have enough time or space in life to do this. So it's actually finally been studied as something that is worthwhile looking at. And what we've kind of figured out is this isn't working right. Okay? So here's a little Old Testament fun you can have with this. The Hebrew word that's translated trust or faith or belief means to create tension. So if you're going to walk by faith, if you're going to trust the God of the Bible, it's going to cause you more tension, not less. Most people's view of comfort is that you'll go to church and you'll feel more comfortable, right? Not more disturbed. The actual place you should go is to be more disturbed. Now, if we have time, I bet, without me setting you up, if I ask you all to tell your own personal story, right, we could tell it about anything, you know, your physical life, maybe how you developed physically, and maybe why you were an athlete or weren't an athlete, or why you know, just go through your physical life, including, you know, how you hated the dentist and how, you know, you got a shot when you were a kid and it was fine, and, you know, somebody taught you how to relax, and then somebody else and you still hate needles and or whatever, you know, okay? So, yeah, I bet if I could get you to tell any line of your life, the things that would mark out your life would be the disturbances that you somehow survived or overcame. That's how we tell our stories. But we avoid that uncomfortable space, the space that has tension in it. So we brought up one just a minute ago. A child needs to feel delighted in and have limits at the same time. Right? So you need to be free and limited, because that's the way God created us. Both of those create tension when they're held together in the same space. One of the hardest things for us to do relationally is this bit, right? It's not just male and female, but it's also wanting to be a whole person, separate, unique, solid self, a separate self, if you will. And we also, at the same time, want to feel connected. So you want to feel both of them. Most people will not go through the middle of this. What they do is they go around the outside. We take this trip. We avoid the discomfort, the stretching, challenging middle, and we go either or. Either or. All, none. Right, wrong. Right? Black and white. Something that keeps us from having to mess with the tension. Now, I like to give this illustration because I think it fits here. If you're going to tightrope walk, what do you need? A tight rope, don't you? Somebody said, well, there's slack rope walking now. Well, there is, but have you ever seen anybody walk on a slack rope? It has to have some tightness in it, right? Yeah. So the point is, it's that tension. It's actually a ringing tension, like you would have in a cable. Cable's made up of a whole bunch of wires pulled together. And you need that tension in order to walk on it. But this is what we avoid in our world. And it's a self-protective piece, because we don't like disturbance. Disturbance is not taught to us as normal. So I've got a book at home written about marriage, and the title of it is, What Did You Expect? And I think, and that's what I want to say to Scarlett Johansson. What did you expect? Did you expect it to be what? Just pleasurable? Make you happy all the time? Or are you going to come here and function with this? Listen to James in Scripture. He says this. He says, consider it all joy. Now, not just a little bit of joy, but all joy, when you encounter various challenges, trials, tests. Don't push back and say, oh, that's awful. Consider it a joy. Is that wild? We don't consider it joy most of the time. Why? Because we want to get it right. We want to get out of this uncomfortableness. Somebody's told us that happiness should beat this. If you want a good definition of joy, maybe you can have it this way. I was with somebody the other day, and we were having a conversation at a coffee shop, and this person got a phone call, and it was from their daughter. And when they recognized, well, because it says, you know, your daughter on it, or whatever your smartphone does now to you, you know. And when he realized it was his daughter, you should have seen what happened to his face. What do you think? Eyes lit up, man. He was so happy to get that call, right? Have you ever had one of those calls? Been going through a day and somebody texts you or calls you, and it's a little surprise, or it's just a gift, or it's, yeah. And what do? That's the experience of joy. That's delight. When you, and that's what joy is. It's delighting in somebody else, actually. It's finally figuring out this is what life is for. It's a relational dance. And I think what most of us do is we give ourselves to work, and we give ourselves to existing, and we give ourselves to all this other stuff, and we don't do the work of relationship. Here's a piece of sociological research you might stick a file in the back of your head. It took about 5,000 pieces of research, and they looked for common threads, and the title of the article was, "Man is not designed to live in cities." So out of all the research that they garnered, what they discovered was that the closer we live in proximity to each other, the more difficult it is to make connection. So the more self-protective we are. And if you want to know one thing that tears up relationships quicker than anything else, it's our self-protective mechanisms. And they start in that first 18 months of brain development. If you want the research on this, I can give it to you. I mean, there's a book about this thick. It's got literally hundreds of resources. And this was a guy that taught at UCLA. His name is Shore, S-H-O-R-E. And he taught for years there, talking about how important this stuff is and how it sets up our emotional world. And if you're going to, part of what I'm talking about now is, if you want to be mature, you actually can alter your history, your brain's history. You can actually change the way you think, see, experience life. You can taste it more thoroughly, savor it more deeply, be less of a victim of it, more of a, not mastered by it, but more aware of it, I suppose would be the word. Yeah.
This is helpful. So my husband and I went to some counseling like back in spring, and I found it really interesting what the gentleman said to me was, because I kind of was like, I just want everybody to leave me alone. Just leave me alone. Everybody needs something from me. I just want to be left alone. He's like, Dad, you think you want to be left alone? You think you're going to recharge being left alone, but really you are made to be relational, and you will actually recharge more by being relational with your husband. And I found that very interesting, just how you're talking about us being made relational, and how you talked about in the neighborhood people tend to start to close off with stuff. And I just thought, I just needed some space, you know, like they're so needy, but we're made a certain way, and what I thought I needed was the opposite.
And we are substituting a virtual connection via text. And as marvelous as this technology is, it's keeping us busy, and we don't have enough time to savor, reflect, ponder, wonder, be creative, engage our imagination. So developmentally, the culture is actually going backwards. We can now argue that most, when we talk about maturity from this point of view, you probably have, around 8% that would fall into to a maturing category, and it's because it's shut off in our culture. So you're sitting in an environment or a milieu that doesn't contribute to stretching you, to growing you, to telling you the truth. And hopefully you'll get to a counselor who can do that, who can say, yeah, you think you can go this way, but it's probably going to be just the opposite way. Who wants this? Who sees that as an opportunity? Most of us don't. Most of us see it as something to be fixed. Oh, this is a problem to be solved. Instead of, no, this is the place that you're going to grow. So I like to label it this way. There's clean pain and dirty pain. Clean pain and dirty pain. And one of the things that a mature person learns how to do, wrote it down here, is that they endure hardship well. That's a marker of a mature person. That's clean pain. Everybody has it. Nobody's exempt. It comes into everybody's life somehow. As many people that think they're independent souls and aren't accountable to anybody, well, guess what? What's Bob Dylan's song? You got to serve somebody. Everybody does. I was with a cardiovascular surgeon in Fort Worth, and we were going to go have lunch. And he said, "You're going to have to wait a minute." He said, "Drop me off at the hospital." So I drove him over to the hospital, and he ran inside, and about 15 minutes later he came out, and I said, "What?" He said, "Well," he said, "a 16-year-old file keeper called him and said, you wanted to admit this person, but we can't admit them until you get your records up to date." So he had to go write a couple records so that he could get in the limits so that this gal could be admitted to the hospital. And I drove away laughing inside, because here he was, this massive personality in the medical community, at the mercy of a 16-year-old dictating to him how he had to serve in order to gain this. I mean, it was just a memory for me of, yeah, don't get too big for your whatever, because it'll catch you somehow. You okay?
Hud made a really just profound statement that I'm still chewing on. That nothing tears down relationship more than one's self-protective nature and tendencies. That's powerful. And so what are the most common ways that that's manifested in people's actions? Because if we can identify that, then we see the ways that relationships are torn down. So how's that self-protective tendency, how's it often manifested?
Maybe a way to think about this is that almost all mental illness is a self-protective behavior in extreme. So a narcissist who can't allow you to be weak and will take advantage of it, and that's what happens in a lot of marriages, for instance. And narcissism is a sign that somebody's underdeveloped or maldeveloped in some dimension. And the self-protective piece is they don't want any pain in their life. So they actually cause dirty pain by pushing back against the other. I was reading an example today. Maybe I could read it to you. It's kind of relates to this a little bit. But there's a list of ways. I mean, you can get mad, go away. You can, in my notes here, I have 3 ways we have a tendency to do this. You can, in these notes, I called them 3 maturity detours. One, you can get in a conflict. You can learn how, you can stay in a fight. And I argue that there's a whale of a lot of difference between fighting and wrestling in a relationship. Fighting is this either-or category. Wrestling pulls you into the middle, right? Wrestling, you're equally matched. You have a referee. You play by the rules. There's time limits. Fighting, no time limits. It's a win or lose proposition. And the quip is, If you win in a fight, in a relationship, the relationship always loses. Okay? So still to your point, another one here is either we'll stay in conflict or we'll run away. We'll shut down, go distance. By the way, the strongest single communication tool in a human's toolbox is what? Sign language? Body language. Close. Silence. Silence is the most, it's stonewalling. You shut down. A lot of guys will go read the newspaper, run away and work more, or play, or do something, other than to stay here. Be exposed. Grapple with these issues. And both people have to be there in that place. And the second one is we play one up, one down. So we power up, or we no longer need the relationship a little bit. The person that is the least needy is the person that's the most in control. Did I say that right? I think I did. You have to think about it a little bit. Person that's the most needy is the one that's has the most control. I don't need you. I walk away. I'm out of here.
I like that for myself. I was just thinking when you were talking about shut down, is that I've always communicated, and I couldn't be a communicator, but it's been the last 3 years that I've just shut down. Completely shut down. So does that come back from when I was my birth at 18 months, or is that something that I have started to become?
Well, we're complex people, so my hunch is it's probably interaction of all that stuff together. It's like an equation, so you can't leave one piece out of the equation. And I had a gal that was depressed, and I think she was depressed because 4 or 5 things had to be in place at the same time. And when you took one of them away, she wasn't depressed anymore, but she had these other 4 things she needed to deal with. But it didn't show up as depression. And one of the reasons why she was depressed was she was taking an antihistamine whose side effect was depression. Crazy stuff. So be careful with how you try to solve that as a problem. You want to enter into this relationally as opposed to seeing it as a problem to be solved. Problem to be solved is another way that I think we avoid having to do the relational work. And guys we're wonderful at this. We're fixers. And we want to, give me a job, give me something I can fix. Well, you can't fix a relational dance. You can be in it. You can share, you can participate, you can do all that, but it's not a problem to be solved. It's a relationship to be walked through, to be entered into, to engage in, if you will. The third thing I wrote down here is what I call the third step. It's getting someone to take your side, and that'll calm you down. And it's outside of the relationship, right? So you're inviting a third person into it, so we don't have to do face-to-face sharing. Takes the focus off of the tensions in relationships, and more, allows me to focus on just what's happening inside of me. Well, I was going to read you an example, then I'm going to give you a test. It says, this is a pastor talking. He says, the church wasn't the only part of my life impacted by this problem. He said, my marriage looked a lot like my ministry. It had all the trappings of success on the outside, but inwardly there was something missing. I didn't realize it at the time, but my wife was dying emotionally. She tried to tell me, but I thought she was just overreacting. In my mind, I was doing the best I could. I scheduled date nights. I made sure I was home when she wanted me to be home. But my wife knew she was getting the scraps, and it was killing her. So one night when we were on one of our date nights, she opened up about it. She said, I feel like I'm being trapped in a cave with prison bars across the opening. You're standing outside like it's no big deal. You laugh, you smile, you talk to other people. Occasionally, you remember that I'm here, and you throw me some leftover scraps. She started to cry. He said, I would like to say that I became very gentle and tender toward her, that I immediately saw the error of my ways and validated her emotions. But the truth is, I got mad. Why couldn't she appreciate how hard I was trying? We were on a date, weren't we? She was being unreasonable. Her expectations were unreasonable. She was just needy. That was it. What I didn't understand was that my emotional immaturity was killing her, just like it was sabotaging everything I did in the church. Today, if you ask my wife, she'll tell you that the best thing that ever happened to our marriage was the discovery of this material, if you will, about how our brains function. It is also the best leadership help I've ever received. I'm not saying that my marriage is perfect and I'm still not a world-class leader, but I'm much better at both than I used to be, and I feel like I'm just getting started. Well, yeah, there's a jillion ways we can power up, we can go away, and you gotta say, you know, what's missing in this? Well, what's missing in it for most of us is joy, profound joy, just to, you know, yeah, this is tough, but I want to be here. You know, I want to move towards you. I want to keep making moves towards you rather than away. And by the way, on this scale, you're always moving somewhere. You're never static here. And you can be well connected one day and disconnected the next. So the dance is constantly moving, but you need some space to breathe. Intimacy can't happen in a walled-off twosome, and it's not a constant. So it's a moving, alive, and so you have to nurture it. And some days it's healthier than other days, and some days it's more robust than other days, and sometimes it's more fun to do this than other days, and sometimes it's just hard work, right? These are just ways that we reduce discomfort in a relationship. Okay? First one is conflict and distance, argue and fight, passionate making up sometimes. Usually there's lots of anger, connection often, but we attack and defend in order to create connection and distance. You know, that's not healthy. It's a way, though, to try to reduce the discomfort you feel. And remember, I started off saying we were made to have to grapple with stress. That's the way you grow. You grow when you deal with stress. And so that's what Joy's trying to tell you. It's actually a perspective that allows you to deal with increasing levels of stress. And that means that you can, what did I say just a second ago? That you can endure hardship, which is a big marker of adults.
Hey, can I interrupt?
Yeah.
But this has to do with something long. Can you either comment now or think about it and comment later on this kind of trend? It's a relational trend to be thinking about not like polygamy, really, where the relational, but it's not just focused on one person, and that is also pattern of culture that's happening too. Can you comment or just think about, it doesn't have to be right now, but sometime, just about like how we're created in that sense to be focused on one person versus relational with many, or does that make sense?
Well, that's what Scarlett Johansson said. She said we weren't made to be monogamous. It's way too hard. So you get out from under the tension of having to grow with one person. And that, by the way, this is kind of fascinating to me. Biblically, God said in the garden, I created you to be limited, and I want you to be limited by just not eating of this one tree. That's all he said. He didn't say, you can't use the tree to, build a house. He said, just don't eat from it. That's the only thing he said. So he reverses it on the other side when we get out of the garden, when we leave the garden, and he says something like this. He says, I want you to only really be true to one relationship on the face of the earth, and that's marriage. Now, did they do it in the Old Testament? No way. I mean, polygamy and concubines and multiple marriages, and, God still worked with them in the midst of that. So don't confuse what we can do with what we ought to do. And what we ought to do is be in a single relationship, because that relationship is designed to grow you. Marriage is a people-growing machine, if you'll let it be. But too often, we bail out of it because it's not making us happy. It's too uncomfortable. This discomfort that comes here, the anxiety that comes here, the tension that comes here when you're trying to merge two different personalities and two different sexes, and two different histories, and two different family origins, and, you know, all that kind of stuff. It just makes it more challenging. But I think today, to make this argument today culturally is just foolish. Nobody wants to mess with it. And that'll just tell you the culture wants to go backwards, wants to make it easier. Not more challenging, but less challenging, really.
Can you talk a little bit more about what a healthy motivator, I know it's like you just mentioned, you know, like it's a people maybe machine, but like that's a hard sell. You know, you're saying so the further you get, the closer you get, the more tension involved, more discomfort, more stress you should expect. Yeah, you should frame it in a positive context because it'll grow you, but you know, deep down behind that pleasure and happiness, our motivators are really avoidance of pain. Like that's the sort of engine that drives most emotional decision making. So if this is juxtaposed to that, like what's the payoff? Like what's the motivator that actually is healthy and sustainable and worth going through that kind of, you know, open-ended, you know, attention creation? Because that doesn't, it just seems like it's a really hard sell.
It is.
Why do it?
It is in a quote functional sense, if you will. I would draw a line here probably and would say that what makes this perspective different and maybe what the motivator should be is that I've designed to give away. I wrote down here in my notes that maybe
Could I just?
maybe the highest function, maybe the highest function of maturity is loving well. Okay? So maybe that's the kind of the marker up there, because that's the thing that will most satisfy your soul. It's not more money, it's not more power, it's not more relationships, if you will. It's learning how to love well. And loving well is what we're designed to do. And you've got two kids that are small enough still, at least the little one, to not push back too much, and you get to give to them without expecting something in return. I mean, that's a sacrifice. But that's the kind of love that really is soul satisfying ultimately, because that's the way we're made. But I think we're resisting that, and we're saying in essence, no, I'm made to be in charge so that I don't have to mess with this other. I just think you will find the markers in your story. If you look back at them, they'll be the ones where you overcame something. You know, you stepped up another notch, and the soul satisfying side of it will be the relational component. It's wait a minute, right here I have a question first.
I just thought is that at least for me on the circular payoff, it's intimacy. As we said earlier, it's that rare quality in life that escapes most of us.
Shall we define intimacy quickly? Intimacy means to be known. Doesn't mean to know another person. It means to be known. I'm in charge of whether you know me or not. If Nancy says she loves me and I'm withholding something from her, I can't trust her love for me. Does that make sense? Because if she knew that next piece of data, she might say, that's it. We're done. Right? So to be known is a big deal, number one. And it's amazing to me how many adults don't have what I would call a solid sense of self. And a solid sense of self means that I can bring myself to this table. This is what I call a personal responsibility view of relationships. I'm personally responsible for what I bring to the relationship. I am not responsible for whether Nancy receives it or whether she rejects it. I'm not responsible for what Nancy does or doesn't do. I'm only responsible for what I bring. And the challenge to me, biblically, is if I come as a whole person, then I'm going to want to treat her in the same way that I would want to be treated. So I can seek to understand, but I can't make her understand me. You know, That's a Stephen Covey thing. Seek to understand, not to be understood. And another thing I would say to you is the purpose of intimacy is not agreement. Agreement would be out here on this side. The goal isn't agreement here. The goal is understanding. Because then you can put two people together as the best team. You know, if she catches the ball and I throw the ball well, then that's the role we should play in a relationship. And we should get better at understanding our limits, but then how we're made specifically for this. The soul-satisfying part of giving yourself away is, I think, the ultimate motivation here. It's I get to give away, and if you're received, it's a big deal. Yeah.
I just think that in each individual, choices matter. And you've always said this phrase there will never be a time when you can't do a loving thing.
You'll never be put in a situation.
You'll never be put in a situation where you can't make the choice to do a loving thing. But we so defend ourselves, we don't want to do a loving thing when someone, challenges us in any way. So that's a hard lesson to learn, actually.
Okay, we have about 28 minutes. I want to give you a test. So you need to have a piece of paper and a pencil somewhere. And you can't, I'll give you way too much. I just want you to capture pieces of this. This is just a way to assess yourself. And assessments are not a bad thing, actually. They're a good thing because they tell you where you stand a little bit. And this will help you somewhat, hopefully, with... and I'll try to go slow enough that you can capture it. Don't try to just capture the ones that fit, right? It kind of triggers something right immediately. I think there are probably 4 primary core categories of emotional maturity. Emotional/relational maturity. And so this can help you when you think about other people and as well as yourself. So it's not just, it's universal, if you will. The first category is how you remain relational. In other words, relationships are bigger than problems. That's an important sign of emotional maturity. That relationships for you are more important than solving a problem. That makes sense? So I have 4 things underneath that. Do you avoid conflict? Most of the people are much more likely to confront people and problems when they know that they can remain relational through the process and hang on to joy. When you lack those skills, avoidance looks like a pretty good thing. A lot of people are conflict avoiders or conflict averse. Or somebody has said to them that if you have conflict, there's something that needs to be fixed. Instead of, oh, this is an opportunity. Consider it all joy when various conflicts come your way. The second one, under remaining relational, would be, do you avoid people who upset you? I know a senior pastor had 2 doors to his office, and his secretary would buzz him when somebody was there he didn't want to see, and he'd go out the back door, and then he could honestly say to her he wasn't in his office. That's true. I know another church where when they rebuilt the church, they redid a wing of the church, this guy had a hidden room in it. And he wound up being caught with pornography addiction. But it was so crazy, he actually had kind of a secret room built in the church, and he and one other person knew about it. Is that crazy? I think that's crazy. But that's what happens That's what happens when we can't look at life in the light. The third thing about under relational, emotional relational stuff, where relationships trump problems, do you use negative emotions like shame, anger, fear, and disgust to control people? Shame, anger, fear, disgust. If that's the case, you value problem solving over remaining relational. Because shame and anger and fear and disgust will all add distance to your relationship. They all separate this holy space. They all move you away from that middle piece. Nancy grew up in a shaming home. And it's hard not to use that as a self-protective thing. Yeah, and we didn't know. I mean, we were years fused in our relationship thinking that we were wonderful. But we used all this stuff to try to control. And, you know, the fact is you can't control another human being. Fourth thing under this is when conflict arises, do you make people choose sides? Or do you reach out to those who oppose you? Check what you did during the election last year. I know families that are still not talking to one another and may not for a long time. So divisive. Marker of immaturity. Where was our culture? Did it move toward one another in that differences, or did it move further polemically away? It just tells you the level. This is not about agreement. You know, there's a difference between acceptance and, what's the other word? Agreement, yeah. Well, a lot of difference between acceptance and agreement. I can accept you and not agree with you. Same space. But too often we hold up agreement as the basis on which I'm accepted or not. Make sense? Civilized conversation takes a whole different ballgame, but we're going in the opposite direction, I think, culturally, for lots of reasons. Second major area. First area was about relationships. The second one is how do you become a whole person, or how do you act like yourself? Too often we give up ourselves in a conversation. So here's what needs to happen in a marriage, in my mind. You have a whole person male and a whole person female who's God's man and God's woman, and they come together, whole people. Too often what we teach is we teach something like this. You get married and you lose your soul. You know, oh, it's a ball and chain. Oh, you're going to be tied down. No, it ought to be the thing that actually gives you freedom, because it's the way God designed you. He designed you to be exposed and to be known so that you could work on your immaturity in some way. So here we go. We act like ourselves when we live out of the best version of who we are. I remember saying this to a couple one time when they left my office. I said, work out of the best in you this week. Because what I could see in them was wonderful things, but they worked out of the absolute worst in each other. They triggered and did this dance that was just caustic. If big emotions turn you into a different person, you struggle to act like yourself under pressure. If big emotions turn you into a different person, you struggle to act like yourself under pressure. If you've never developed a strong sense of yourself, you may act like a possum or a predator instead of a protector. Possum you hide, predator you attack, protector is what God made you to be. So here's some questions related to acting like yourself. Do people walk on eggshells around you? Do people feel safe disagreeing with you? Or do they keep their opinions to themselves? Third one, do they share their honest opinions regularly, or do they wait to see which direction you want the discussion to go? people avoid bringing their problems to you? Remember the story I told at the top of this talk about the gal that was accusing her husband of pornography? Was he more likely to come talk to her or less? People avoid bringing their problems to you. Fifth one, can people expect a tender response to their weaknesses? Or do they fear that weakness will be used against them? So Nancy and I got in such bad habits that now I'll say, I want to tell you this, but you can't use it against me. And she'll go, well, maybe I want to wait until you tell me. You just never know when it'll come handy, you know, especially in a social event of some kind.
Can you repeat 4 and 5?
Yeah, do people avoid bringing problems to you? That'd be 4. And the fifth one is, can they expect a tender response to their weaknesses? Tender, gentle, humble, kind. You know, it's okay. But we have such an aversion in our culture to failure, not knowing that failure is probably one of the greatest teachers ever. It just is. But we set it up so that you can't fail. When I was a prof, I didn't know this. It was reported to me later. For most of my tenure, I was at this one school for 9 years. For most of my tenure, I gave more F's than any other professor on the campus. I didn't give them. I awarded them. They earned them. They got the award. And it was beyond me how that happened. I mean, and now, I just read an article a couple weeks back about a Harvard professor that has 2 sets of grades, one that goes to the registrar and one he gives to the student. One that goes to the registrar is much higher than the actual ones. He wants the student to know how he actually thinks they did, but because he wants to keep his job, he has to give them the grade. Because they're going to Harvard and it's a big money, right? Aren't we having a good time here? How about this? Do you reveal your weaknesses and ask others for help? When I was first playing ball as a kid, I didn't want to be coached. Why? That was me. I was so insecure. I was afraid that I would be exposed and somebody'd find out that I was weak, you know. And I was listening to an interview with Peyton Manning and Roger Federer, and the guy at the very last question he asked him was, how do you feel about coaching? And they both hopped on it. They said, we can't get enough now. At the very top of their game, they realized how much they needed it. That's a sign of what? Maturity. Do you fear people discovering what you are really thinking or feeling about a problem? Do you fear people? Do you just fear people discovering what you are really thinking or feeling about the problems you're facing? Or maybe another way to say that is, do you often present yourself as stronger than you really feel? That's called posturing or posing. Okay, the next big area, first area is relational, second area is acting like yourself, so you don't get lost in a conversation. You say, yeah, that's me. But one of the best pieces of advice I got when I was doing my doctoral work was, this gal said, you control the next question by the way you answer the question that was given to you in the first place. That was fascinating. And then she went on to say that you know more than all of those people in there about your particular subject. She said they know more about some things than you do, but you know more than they do about some things. Just relax. You know, I mean, She was fighting for a perspective, right? That's what joy is. It's fighting for a perspective. So the third area is this. If a child learns that he's delighted in, then he has a core piece of the puzzle so that he can return to that over and over and over and over again and say, I'm a good person regardless of what happens. I'm loved. I don't have to earn this. It's been given to me. So this is called being able to return to joy when you're under pressure of some kind. Can you do it by maintaining your capacity to be relational, act like yourselves when you're upset, instead of shutting down parts of yourself? So here's the questions. Do you know how to quiet yourself when your emotions get upset? Do you know how to quiet yourself when your emotions get upset? Second one, do you? Yes.
Can you elaborate on that? Are you saying like hold your tongue, or are you saying like just be like, you know what, I'm like that earlier
Think about it this way. It's one thing to have a feeling, but after that you have a choice you have to make as to what you're going to do on the basis of this feeling. So does being angry mean that you have to raise your voice or yell or exert more energy, or does being angry and upset give you an opportunity to make a choice to try to remedy the situation or feed in to be an asset or reduce the intensity? Or, you know, I've had to mediate family disputes, got to mediate children and a founder of a business when they were trying to transfer. The founder wanted to retire and and then transferring that to the children was really interesting from a family of origin standpoint. And so you had all this strong emotion, but you still have a choice as to how you're going to respond to it. So
But the other side of it is you can become stoic and just,
well, that's right. That's not.
quiet yourself with that emotion. However, don't become just.
But stoicism is denying the emotion. Maybe would be the way to say it.
I can quiet myself. That doesn't mean I'm not quiet.
Well, somebody asked me what my major feeling was, my major feeling state was, a few years ago, 15 years ago. I'm old. And I said, well, it's sadness. And they said, well, you don't look sad. You don't act sad. I said, but that's the primary sense for me walking through life, because life's tough, man, you know? And people are carrying all kinds of baggage around that they can't process for whatever reason. They either don't have a place, or they don't have the courage to, or they don't know how to, or all the above and more. The world's just sad, and I think if you can take mad and move it to sad, it really helps me. And then from sad, I've got a better platform on which to do something constructive with my behavior. So I have the feeling, and then I have a choice. And you can say that to your kids. I said it to one of my grandgirls one time. Across the room, the two of them were arguing, the two granddaughters were arguing, and nobody else was in the room but me and them. And one of them looked at me, and I said, well, you can make a better choice. That's all I said. And they did. It was just fun to watch. They just, because they realized they could make a better choice than they were making. We didn't have a long discussion about how they were feeling, but it was, from a grandfather's standpoint, it was just a delight to be in the room and to have that experience with them. But if we can remind ourselves of that, that quiets us. Does that make sense? Okay, here's the second question. Do you quiet well with others, or do you isolate yourself when you're upset? Do you do better with others or by yourself? You need to know that, because you can't return to joy unless you have some understanding of that. Gosh, come on. The third thing under making your way back to this anchor point of I'm okay. You know, God loves me. I count. I matter. Is do you reestablish relational connection quickly after you're upset? Or do strong negative emotions control your relationships for days, weeks, and even months? Yeah. Do you reestablish relational connection quickly after upset emotions, or do strong negative emotions control your relationships for days, weeks, and even months? Give you a little hint, guys. We have a tendency, once we've been stabbed, to hang on to it longer and have a harder time recovering than women do. That's generalization. I know it doesn't fit everybody, but just be on the alert. Guys have trouble letting go of their anger. We'll hang on to it for a long time. Quickly. Come back quickly. The quicker you are to the event, the more impact it'll have on your own soul. The more likely it is to train your brain better. But you need to have some understanding of how you react in the first place. Okay, 4, under joy, do you help others return to authentic relationships quickly from unpleasant emotions? I mean, it's like losing a game, a championship game that you've just worked on. I mean, that's a big deal. I've always been a little upset with the media when they stick a microphone into some guy's face and say, how do you feel? You just lost the world championship, you know? How do you feel about that? Wonderful. What do you want me to say? 5, do you see moments of upset as opportunities to strengthen relationships? Consider it all what? Joy when various trials, upsets, conflicts come your way. Do you see moments as upset as opportunities to strengthen relationship? We can get stronger. We have a difference here, but there's a way for us to navigate this. It's our terrain to navigate, you know. We got ourselves here. How can we think about this in a creative way? How about this? Number 6, do you stay annoyed with people who trigger your emotions? Do you stay annoyed with people who trigger your emotions? I like that word, annoyed. It's just mild enough that you can carry it around civilly, can't you? How about ignoring people relationally when their emotions are not in sync with yours? You ignore people relationally when their emotions are not in sync with yours. By the way, synchronicity is really powerful. When somebody's sad, identifying with the sad, being in sync with their sadness is really a big deal. And by the way, it's one of the greatest things you can do for little kids, is do things that synchronize with them. You know, if a kid starts pounding on the table and you pound on the table, you watch what he does, or she. They'll pound on the table more, you know, and you pound more and they pound more, you know, and it's a great fun, isn't it? So. Okay, and then the last one here is, do you help your group maintain an identity that's resilient in the face of difficulty? Do you help a group maintain an identity? And that's what joy is about. Joy is about identity. Joy is about, I'm a worthwhile person. I count. I matter. Do you help a group, your family, whatever, your church? Do you help them maintain an identity that is resilient in the face of difficulty? You know, we're okay. I think that's a coach's task at the end of a game. Give it your best. Don't stop now, you know. Sport's emotional, folks. I mean, after the physical part, what drives it is this piece. Okay, you got 5 more minutes, and we got one more thing to do. The last piece of emotional maturity, first one's relational, right? Second one is acting like yourself, being a whole person. Third one, being able to go back to a sense of identity that says, I know who I am. You don't determine who I am. My sense of validation does not come from outside of me. It comes from inside of me. I'm a, you know, I don't want to say it this way. I think it's actually God saying you're okay. But somehow you need to embrace that. Too often we have externalized it, so I need you to say I'm okay. All right, so here we go. Enduring hardship well is the fourth one. The key to enduring hardship is capacity. You may have the skill, but how developed is it? Let me give you an example. If you may be able to handle a certain amount of pressure and still act like yourself and remain relational, but how much does it take before I get overwhelmed? Everybody has limits. Capacity is about expanding those limits so that we are able to demonstrate those skills consistently regardless of how circumstances change. Circumstances are back up here under happiness. No matter how the circumstances change, how big a capacity do you have? I have more capacity today than I did when I first started. When I first started counseling, if a couple came in and they were angry at each other, I thought I was the one that was causing it and I had to fix it. Wrong. On a number of counts, by the way. You know, a much greater capacity today. But part of it comes from this volume of input that I've received over years, etc. Okay, so here we go. Here's some questions under hardship. How much stress does it take for you to avoid relationships? Or maybe another way to say that is how much pressure can you handle before you snap and turn into a different person? The Jekyll and Hyde effect, right? Don't sit in Daddy's chair. You know what happens if you sit in Daddy's chair. Or how about the last one here is the third one. How much can you handle before you disappear and turn to your cravings for comfort? Okay, I'll go slower. Nancy said I was too fast. How much pressure can you handle before you snap, turn into a different person? The last one is, how much can you handle before you disappear? Okay, I have 1 minute. Those are the 4 major areas. And these are a couple questions you can ask yourself about the first 3 years of your life. Huh? You'll understand here in just a second. Your mind remembers it. That's the problem. Right? I have experienced strong, loving, caring bonds with a mother or a woman. And the same question for a man. I have experienced strong, loving, caring bonds with a mother or a woman. And I have experienced strong, loving, caring bonds with a father or a man.
Yes, no, but,
Well, that would be yes, or usually, or at times, or not at all. Something like that. Just kind of give yourself you'll know. So many people are wounded around this stuff. And it may have been a father that loved you dearly but couldn't show it. So you never bonded. There was no attachment. You just...
Were you talking about just the first 3 years, or how was it?
First 3 years. Infant level. important needs were met until I learned to ask. As a child, your needs need to be met until you can finally figure out what you need. Somebody else took responsibility for meeting my needs. Here's a big one. Other people took a lead, synchronized with me and my feelings first. In other words, if I was feeling sad or hurt, they started there instead of, you're tough, don't cry, doesn't hurt. And a big one, which is, and I don't know how to state this one really, being quiet with another helped me calm myself with other people around. In other words, I didn't have to run off to my bedroom to calm down. You know, go to your room and tell. My kids, I've got 2 of them here today, so they can yell at me about this, but when they were growing up, I was teaching parenting classes, and I remember I didn't like the idea of sending them off to their room. So I did what was called a relational timeout. They had to sit right next to me and be still to prove to me that I could trust them again. Because the only reason they needed a timeout is because they'd betrayed my trust somehow anyway. They said they would do something, or I asked them to do something, they didn't do it. And then if I got up and moved, they had to move with me, but then they had to prove that they could sit there and contain themselves for a little bit so I could trust them again, so we could start all over again. And I don't think they liked it too much, but what was for me was the beginning of trying to get at this together. Let's calm down. I get it. I'm here with you. It's okay to be upset. You know, maybe I can help you with this way.
What's the question we ask ourselves if our parents did that for us?
Yeah.
Or they sent us to our
Yeah, together. Were you able to quiet yourself together and calm yourself with people around rather than isolating in some way? So this is, what am I talking about now? We're talking about relationships again, aren't we? Don't go away. Stay in relationships somehow. And it doesn't, I mean, the form doesn't matter. The fact matters. And I just remember, I remember learning from my parents, my mother in particular, she was a teacher, that discipline was always forward-looking. She just didn't go backwards with me. She always went forward. She didn't go back and pick on what I'd done. She said, what are we going to do now? What are we going to do with that? Where are we going to go with this? And that's what the Bible does. The Bible, all God's discipline is future-oriented, never past. Punishment is past. And there's a big difference between discipline and punishment. Huge difference, actually. In fact, the verses I just read out of Hebrews chapter 12, the next thing in that chapter is about discipline, which we're going to talk about tomorrow a little bit as a sign of maturity, because discipline is a marker of maturity, for sure. Have you had just so much fun? You just look so happy.
Can you say those 4 main things quickly
Yep.
that we did to also learn?
Okay, remain relational, have a solid sense of self, or act like yourself in every situation. So I can count on you being the same no matter where I am. You know, you're not going to be one way over here and another way over here and another way over here. Okay? And the third one is you have the ability to go back to feeling a sense of okayness about yourself, sense of identity, or returning to joy if you want to. I'm okay, I'm precious, I'm I count, I matter, I'm here for a reason. This stuff is hard to hold on to. One of Nancy's friend's sons yesterday killed himself in front of her. He's how old, 36 or something? Yeah. Yeah, so you just go, so this is constant. You wonder why I'm sad? Now, it doesn't take much if you begin to listen. Just listen under the surface, and it's there all the time in almost everybody's life. So this, I'm just pleading with you. You mature, you'll stick your head above that flow of that river or that cloud or whatever you want to say. You'll have your feet on the ground. You'll be able to see. You'll not go off in la la land. And the last thing is being able to handle hardship well. Not just endure it, but endure it well. And that's why I started off with the verse. Jesus, who for the joy set before him, did what? Endured the cross. He didn't like it. I'm not saying there's happy stuff, but if you want to grow, it's necessary. Because life is like that. Well, you're very kind to sit here this long. My little FaceTime thing is out of space. It says, you can manage your settings and add more storage this way. Yeah. Tomorrow I want to give you I want to start off talking about brain science in the morning a little bit, about how this stuff actually occurs in us, because it'll help you understand what you can do to fight back. And then we'll talk a little more about how this applies relationally to us as adults. And we'll have great food. I already know it. We're going to try to cook a pig tomorrow afternoon, so it'll be cooking right outside here. So, yeah. He or she is happy. Let me pray just a second. Father, thank you for putting us in relationship and giving us resources. I just ask that wherever we are, and everybody's in a different place developmentally. Some of us are older, and I thought when I got older I wouldn't need this stuff anymore, and what a silly notion. But wherever we are in our developmental life, in our maturational life, I pray that we will lean into tasting and seeing that you're good and your ways are better than ours, and somehow, even though the external motivators seem elusive, the internal ones, the soul satisfaction, the steadiness, the calmness, the being present, being able to savor life, and the bitter side and the sweet side, all together, can be ours in full measure. And I pray that we will delight in the gift you give us of life. And I just want to say that will you protect these people for me? My craziness. Help us to sort through what's true, because it'll give us freedom in life. And that's what we're built for. We're built to be free in this world. Help us to give away what we've been given. For your greater glory and our joy, we pray in your Son's name. Amen.